Iron deficiency is the most common nutritional disorder on Earth. The World Health Organization has called it a global epidemic. Billions of people, particularly women, children, and those in developing nations, live with insufficient iron intake. The consequences are documented: fatigue, impaired cognition, weakened immunity, complications in pregnancy. In severe cases, death. The modern response has been supplementation. Iron pills, fortified cereals, enriched flour. We add iron to foods that do not naturally contain enough, because the staple grains we built civilization around, wheat, rice, maize, are not particularly rich in this mineral. And yet, in the highlands of Ethiopia, a region not known for wealth or abundance, rates of iron deficiency anemia have historically been remarkably low. The people are not wealthier. They do not have better access to supplements. They eat a grain. The grain is called Teff. It is the smallest grain cultivated for human consumption. A single kernel is smaller than a poppy seed. It has been grown in the Ethiopian highlands for at least 3,000 years, possibly longer. It contains more iron than wheat, more protein, more fiber. It is naturally gluten-free. And because the grain is so small, it cannot be milled into refined white flour. Every form of this grain is whole grain. Every form retains its nutrients. The populations that eat it daily do not experience the iron deficiency that plagues much of the world. The global agricultural system chose wheat. It chose rice. It chose maize. It did not choose this. The question is not whether the grain is nutritious. The question is what made it invisible, and whether the reasons had anything to do with nutrition at all. The Ethiopian highlands are not hospitable to agriculture. The terrain is mountainous. The soil is often poor. The rains are unpredictable, sometimes flooding, sometimes failing entirely. The altitude reaches over 2,000 meters in much of the arable zone. Most of the world's staple grains cannot thrive in these conditions. And yet, for millennia, the people of this region did not starve. They built one of the oldest continuous civilizations in Africa. They developed a writing system. They constructed churches carved from solid rock. They resisted colonization when nearly every other African nation fell. They did this while eating a grain that much of the world has never heard of. Archaeological evidence suggests cultivation began at least 3,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The tiny seeds have been found in ancient storage sites across the highlands. The grain appears in the earliest records of Ethiopian agriculture, already established as a staple by the time written accounts began. The preparation method that emerged is itself unusual. The grain is ground into flour, mixed with water, and allowed to ferment for several days. The fermentation produces a batter that is poured onto a hot surface and cooked into a large, spongy flatbread. This bread, slightly sour, porous, flexible, becomes both plate and utensil. Stews and vegetables are placed on top. Pieces are torn off and used to scoop food. Nothing is wasted. The fermentation is not incidental. It transforms the grain. When grains ferment, anti-nutrients break down. Phytic acid, which binds to minerals and prevents absorption, diminishes. The minerals that remain, iron, calcium, zinc, become more bioavailable. The body can actually absorb them. The fermentation also produces beneficial bacteria, the same organisms that modern consumers seek in probiotic supplements. This was not understood in biochemical terms by the highland farmers who developed the technique. It was understood in practical terms. People who ate the fermented bread were healthier. Children grew stronger. Mothers recovered faster after childbirth. The knowledge was refined over generations, passed down not as theory but as practice. The grain became inseparable from Ethiopian identity. It was eaten at every meal. It was served at weddings and funerals. It was offered to guests as a sign of hospitality. The preparation of the bread was, and remains, a skilled craft, taught from mothers to daughters across centuries. And then there is the matter of endurance. Ethiopian distance runners have dominated international competition for decades. The highlands that produce the grain also produce athletes capable of extraordinary sustained effort. The connection is not coincidental. The runners eat what their ancestors ate. They train at altitude on the same terrain where the grain has grown for millennia. They consume the iron, the protein, the slow-releasing carbohydrates that the fermented bread provides. Researchers studying athletic performance have noted the diet. They have noted the remarkably low rates of anemia among Ethiopian athletes. They have noted that the grain provides nutrients that other cereals lack. But the grain did not spread. The athletes became famous. The grain remained obscure. The world learned about Ethiopian running. The world did not learn about what Ethiopian runners eat. This asymmetry requires explanation. Something prevented the transfer of knowledge. Something kept the grain contained to the highlands, where it had always grown. The first obstacle was botanical. The grain grows on a plant that reaches only waist height. The seed heads are delicate. The kernels are so small that 100 of them would fit on a fingertip. This miniature scale is not incidental. It is the reason the grain survives where other cereals fail. The tiny seeds mature quickly, sometimes in as little as 6 weeks. They can be planted late if rains are delayed. They can be harvested early if drought threatens. The small size is adaptation, not limitation. But the same qualities that make the grain resilient make it nearly impossible to harvest at scale. Wheat is tall. Its kernels are large. Mechanical harvesters move through wheat fields with efficiency developed over a century of engineering. The combines that transformed American and European agriculture were designed for plants that stand upright and produce substantial grain heads. This grain does not cooperate. The plants lodge. They bend and tangle as they mature. The seed heads shatter easily, dropping kernels before harvest. The seeds themselves are so light that wind scatters them. Traditional harvest methods, developed over millennia, account for these behaviors. Farmers cut the plants by hand, bundle them carefully, and thresh them on prepared surfaces where the tiny grains can be collected. These methods work. They have worked for thousands of years. But they require labor. They require skill. They require patience. Industrial agriculture requires none of these. Industrial agriculture requires machines. When colonial powers mapped their agricultural priorities across Africa, they brought seeds from Europe and the Americas. Wheat, maize, crops that could be grown using methods already developed for European conditions. Crops that could be harvested with equipment already manufactured. Crops that fit the existing system. The tiny highland grain did not fit. It was not rejected after evaluation. It was simply never considered. The colonial agricultural stations that dotted Africa experimented with crops that promised export potential, cash value, scalability. A grain that required hand labor, that grew only in specific highland conditions, that produced a product unfamiliar to European consumers. This was not a priority. The grain continued to grow where it had always grown. The farmers continued their methods. The fermented bread remained central to highland life. But the infrastructure that might have spread the grain globally, the research stations, the breeding programs, the processing facilities, the export networks, was never built. There is another obstacle, less obvious but perhaps more decisive. The grain cannot be refined. When wheat is milled, the kernel can be separated into components. The bran and germ, which contain most of the fiber, minerals, and vitamins, can be removed. What remains is the starchy endosperm, which produces white flour. White flour is shelf-stable. It does not go rancid. It bakes predictably. It became the standard of industrial food production. It is also nutritionally diminished. The refining process removes the iron. It removes the fiber. It removes the B vitamins. This is why flour is enriched. Synthetic nutrients are added back to replace what milling removed. The modern loaf of white bread is a technological product engineered to compensate for the deficiencies created by its own processing. The tiny highland grain cannot undergo this process. The kernels are too small to separate. There is no way to remove the bran and germ without losing the entire grain. Every form of this grain, flour, porridge, bread, is whole grain by necessity. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, this was seen as a deficiency. Whole grains were peasant food. White flour was modern. White bread was progress. The grain that could not be refined was, by definition, primitive. The logic was circular, but it was powerful. The grain was not adopted because it could not be processed. It could not be processed because no one invested in alternatives to refining. No one invested because the grain was not adopted. The cycle reinforced itself for more than a century. And there is one more factor. In 2006, the Ethiopian government, observing rising global interest in the grain, banned its export. The concern was domestic food security. If external demand drove up prices, ordinary Ethiopians might not be able to afford their own staple food. The ban was eventually relaxed, but it reinforced the grain's isolation during the very period when global interest was beginning to grow. The grain was not rejected because it failed. It was bypassed because it did not conform to systems designed for other crops entirely. The nutritional analysis, when researchers finally conducted it, confirmed what Ethiopian mothers had known for generations. The iron content is substantial, higher than wheat, higher than rice, higher than most cereals measured. The protein content ranges from 10 to 13%, comparable to wheat, but with a difference. This grain contains lysine, an essential amino acid that most cereals lack. The protein is more complete, more usable by the human body. The fiber content is exceptional. A single serving provides more dietary fiber than most grains offer. The fiber includes resistant starch, a type that passes through the small intestine undigested and feeds beneficial bacteria in the colon. The prebiotic effect supports gut health in ways that refined grains cannot. The glycemic index is low. The combination of fiber, protein, and the grain's physical structure slows digestion. Blood sugar rises gradually rather than spiking. For populations managing diabetes, for athletes seeking sustained energy, for anyone concerned with metabolic health, this profile is relevant. The mineral density extends beyond iron. Calcium levels are unusual for a grain, a nutrient typically sought from dairy or supplements. Magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc are present in meaningful quantities. The fermentation process that produces the traditional bread increases absorption of these minerals. And there is the matter of gluten. The grain contains none. This is not a breeding achievement or a processing technique. It is simply the nature of the plant. The proteins that cause celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, the proteins that have driven millions of consumers toward gluten-free alternatives, do not exist in this grain. The gluten-free market has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most gluten-free products achieve their status through processing, through substitution, through formulation. They replace wheat with starches and gums that mimic texture without providing nutrition. The resulting products are often lower in protein, lower in fiber, higher in glycemic impact than the wheat they replace. This grain requires no substitution. It is what it is. The nutrition is inherent. The inability to refine, which once marked the grain as primitive, now appears as an advantage in an era when nutritionists recommend whole grains over-processed, when fiber intake is consistently below recommended levels, when the diseases of industrial civilization, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, trace partly to refined carbohydrates. A grain that cannot be refined begins to look less like a limitation and more like protection. The climate resilience adds another dimension. The plant tolerates drought. Its short growing cycle allows planting after rains arrive and harvest before they end. It also tolerates waterlogging, unusual for a cereal crop. The root system stabilizes soil. The plant grows in poor conditions that would defeat wheat or maize. Agricultural projections suggest that the Ethiopian highlands will become drier and less predictable as climate patterns shift. The crops that replaced traditional varieties may fail more frequently. The ancient grain, adapted to exactly these stresses, may prove more reliable than the imports that were supposed to represent progress. Some farmers outside Ethiopia have begun growing it. Small operations in the American West, in the Netherlands, in Australia, have experimented with cultivation. The challenges remain. The harvest is difficult, the processing unfamiliar, the markets uncertain. But the grain grows, it produces. It does not require irrigation or chemical inputs that industrial crops demand. The research remains limited. The breeding programs that transformed wheat and rice and maize over the past century, the funding, the institutional attention, the coordinated international effort have not been applied to this grain. What exists is mostly what existed 3,000 years ago. The potential for improvement is largely unexplored. The grain was not lost. It was maintained carefully by the farmers who never stopped growing it. What was lost was the opportunity to understand it, to develop it, to integrate it into global food systems. That opportunity is not permanently foreclosed, but a century of neglect cannot be recovered quickly. The grain is called Teff. It grows across the Ethiopian highlands today as it has for millennia. The terraced fields that step down mountain slopes still produce the tiny seeds. The women who prepare the fermented bread still practice techniques refined over countless generations. The children still eat what their great-grandparents ate. In Addis Ababa, the capital, the bread is served in restaurants that cater to locals and tourists alike. The spongy texture, the slight sourness, the way it tears into perfect pieces for scooping stew, these remain unchanged. The grain that could not be refined is still whole. The grain that could not be mechanized is still harvested by hand. The grain that was never exported still feeds the nation that developed it. But the boundaries have begun to shift. The grain now appears in health food stores in Europe and North America. It is sold as flour, as whole grain, as an ingredient in gluten-free products. The packages emphasize what laboratory analysis confirmed: the iron, the protein, the fiber, the absence of gluten. The prices are high, reflecting the labor-intensive harvest and the fragmented supply chains. It remains a specialty product, not a commodity. Some consumers have learned to prepare it in traditional ways. The fermentation is simple: flour, water, time. The bread requires practice, but not special equipment. The flavor is unfamiliar to palates trained on wheat, but those who persist often develop appreciation. For those who wish to grow it, the requirements are modest. The seeds are available from specialty suppliers. The plant tolerates poor soil and irregular water. It matures quickly. The harvest is difficult at any scale beyond garden production, but the grain stores well once collected. The plant itself is graceful, slender stems topped with delicate seed heads that wave in wind. The grains, when harvested, are almost invisible. They look like sand, like dust, like something that might blow away before it could nourish anyone. But they do not blow away. They are collected, ground, fermented, and eaten as they have been eaten for 3,000 years or more. The highland farmers who first cultivated this grain could not have known what iron deficiency was. They could not have measured lysine content or glycemic index. They knew only that their children grew strong, that their communities survived droughts that devastated lowland farmers, that the food they ate sustained work and endurance and life. They were right. The measurements confirm it. The grain does what they believed it did. The global food system made other choices. It optimized for scale, for machinery, for products that could be refined and shipped and stored indefinitely. These were rational choices within the logic of industrial production, but they were not the only choices possible. The grain remains. It grows where it has always grown, producing what it has always produced. It does not require the systems that excluded it. It requires only soil, water, labor, and the knowledge of how to use it. That knowledge still exists. It was never lost. It was merely contained, held in the highlands by the same barriers that kept the grain from spreading. Now, slowly, the knowledge travels. Seed by seed, harvest by harvest, meal by meal, people outside the highlands are discovering what the highlands always knew. The grain waits as it has always waited. It is small, it is patient, it has outlasted empires, it can outlast a few more decades of neglect.